Welcome to all of you who have joined us. We're so glad today to have just some wonderful guests to talk about how we work together as communicators with our programs teams in our organizations. It's not always a simple, easy thing. So today is to really kind of explore what are the good practices for that? How are people thinking about that? But before we get started, one of the things that we always do to help check in and ground ourselves in the inspiration and the joy of communications is to talk about the things that are stirring our souls. So I'm going to put in the chat our list where we keep these wonderful works of art, inspirations, songs, poems, anything that's stirring your soul lately. We'd love to hear about it as we introduce each other to each other. So if you could put in the chat, who are you? Where in the world are you? You know, any of the details that are important to you to share. And then what is a piece of writing or art or performance or music that has stirred you lately? We all need to feel that movement inside of us in order to really bring the joy to our work. And that's why we do it. All right. So for those of you who are new to this space, we are here to connect to each other and really just build some community where we feel we're supported in ushering in narrative change. Because no one organization, no one human can do it alone. And we're really here to also explore how creativity can be a source of our healing as an individual and as a collective, and how do we use imagination to shape our leadership. And then we do want to, kind of harvest and share some of the wisdom and knowledge and ideas, the practical steps that are known within this group. There's a lot of wisdom here about how we shift, narratives in the social good sector from charity to solidarity. And that's what we're here focused on today. A few ideas that guide us as we start the group. Thanks, Mads, for the intros. They're starting to come in. Thanks, Christine. A few ideas to guide us before we get started with, and Joanne's going to introduce our wonderful guests and get into our topic today. But really, we're here to learn and not critique. And that's just in recognition that we all have something to gain from interacting with each other. We will say that this is a brave, but not necessarily a safe space. Sometimes we will be challenged and pushed outside of our comfort zones. We do operate as much as possible by consent. So please know that all the activities, all the invitations you'll hear today are opt-in and opt-out. And it's important as we move forward as a sector to really seek permission rather than assume. That's where this stuff gets mucky. As much as possible, speak from the I, not the we. So we're no longer generalizing or assuming a universal lived experience, right? So we've got our differences in race and ethnicity and gender and wealth. So communicators are just really guilty of the royal we. So we're trying to bring us back into I. And then finally, the most important part is say what you gotta say today. Dare to be unprepared. Be authentic. And part of that freedom in this space is really important because as communicators, we've got to be precise and we've got to be perfect all the time, as we're putting out in materials to the world or content to the world. But here we can just say it as we want to. So one of the things stirring my soul, for those of you who were here last month, remember that I have been making tiny books like a crazy person. I love some tiny books. I made one in response to last month's thing. And so I was in Minneapolis. I'm based in Omaha, Nebraska. I was in Minneapolis and I found this thing that looks like a stick of gum, but it's a poem. One of my favorite poems, in fact, famous. So I'm going to read that to you in order to center us a little bit today. And then we'll get into our conversation. Welcome to all the folks chiming in on the chat. So we start this session by reconnecting to the wisdom of our bodies and our breath. And you're welcome to just shut your eyes or turn off your camera for a moment. It's just an invitation to breathe and be with yourself for a minute in whatever form you want to. But we do this because we're all navigating oppressive systems that seek to disconnect us from ourselves and from each other and from the land and the places that hold us. So if this is safe, if this is available to you, I just invite you to slow your pace and arrive and breathe and listen to this poem. Famous by Naomi Shihab. The river is famous to the fish. The loud voice is famous to silence, which knew it would inherit the earth before anyone said so. The cat sleeping on the fence is famous to the birds watching him from the birdhouse. The tear is famous briefly to the cheek. The idea you carry close to your bosom is famous to your bosom. The boot is famous to the earth, more famous than the dress shoe, which is famous only to floors. The bent photograph is famous to the one who carries it, and not at all famous to the one who is pictured. I want to be famous to shuffling men who smile when crossing streets, sticky children in grocery lines, famous as the one who smiled back. I want to be famous in the way a pulley is famous, or a buttonhole, not because it did anything spectacular, but because it never forgot what it could do. And with those beautiful words from the poem book, and it looks like a stick of gum. Welcome. And now I'll hand over to my wonderful co-host, Joanne.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to see all of you. And thank you so much for setting aside this time of your day, of your life, to be with us, for us to be all together this morning, this afternoon, this evening. You know, we're all connecting from different parts of the world. It's just so wonderful that we can do this. So when we were discussing with Jennifer about what we should talk about this month, I mentioned to her that in September, I started a new role. I'm based in Geneva. I started a new role where it's my first time doing trade communications. And trade is a world that I never really understood beyond a few terminologies and that type of thing. And immediately after I joined, we had a huge event where, of course, I was tasked with the job of doing the communication. I realized how there was a lot of terminology that seemed very, very technical, very jargony, and I was not able to understand, to the point where I was like, I know how to do comms, but I feel so new to this. It's like I'm not understanding sort of like how I'm supposed to break down some of the concepts so that other people are able to understand. And if I'm not understanding and I'm a newbie, then what are the other people who are not in trade actually, how are they feeling about this? So then that's sort of like the genesis of this. I started wondering, how does it impact the kind of stories that we're telling, when the communications department sort of has a different understanding or does not understand very well what the programs people are doing, and that's sort of the genesis. And I'm so thankful for Dipthi and Priscilla just for your presence and for saying yes. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to start introducing our guests, then we can get into the discussion. Yeah. So Priscilla is based in Brazil. She's in Sao Paulo, and she's a Brazilian journalist, a communications specialist, and she's a project manager who works on gender-related issues in Latin America, and she's also worked on these issues abroad. She's worked for international media outlets as a reporter, as a fact checker, and as a gender communications consultant for the International Labour Organization. And she's currently working for Whose Knowledge, and she is the communications lead, or she's a communications co-lead, sorry, for at Whose Knowledge, who basically work towards campaigning to center the knowledge of marginalized communities belonging to the majority world, to campaign for their rights on the internet. And our second speaker is Dipthi Menon. And Dipthi leads on learning and external and internal communications for Urgent Action Fund Asia and Pacific as a communication and learning facilitator. She's also a journalist, a former broadcaster, with over a decade experience in reporting epidemics, natural disasters, and terror attacks. And Dipthi has since been working as a communication for development practitioner and knowledge production specialist with several years of experience on gender issues. She has been working with women's funds ecosystem across Asia and the Pacific for over a decade now. Yeah, and that's just sort of like a tip of the iceberg about our speakers. I mean, there's so much more that they have done, but we sort of just captured it that way. But just to get us started, Dipthi and Priscilla, how do you think the program staff in your organization would describe what you do on the communications team? And why or why not does their understanding matter to you?
Yeah, I see I'm unmuted, so maybe I could start off on that. I currently work in a small team, so the lines are kind of blurred. Also, I hold the dual portfolio of learning in comms. But for this question, I think I could take the breadth of my experience and start with the fact that I think talking in jargons and trying to make sense to people and not really making sense started even during my journalism days, when we used to talk about the OB-WANs and the PTCs, which are the piece to cameras. And we think that everybody knows about these things. And the truth is nobody does. And, you know, when people start asking you basic questions is when you realize that you need to dumb it down for the audience that you're speaking to. And then as you were talking about your trade story, I was thinking about when I was the senior communications officer for a monitoring and evaluation funder, nonprofit. And they used to talk about RCTs and systematic reviews. And these are all things that, you know, used to just go off the top of my head. And RCT was a root canal treatment till randomized controlled trials came into my life. So I hear what you're saying. And from experience of you know, being on these siloed groups of programs and comms, I can tell you that the only way that I know these can be brought together is if communications stops seeing itself and is stopped seen as being a service provider. You know, like there is this grouping of admin, finance, comms, as you know, these allied groups that support the big hallowed work of the programs team. That I think at some point needs to be, I mean, you know, when people from the programs team who are good at communications are part of comms, that's when I feel that, you know, communications then gets its own place under the sun. That I would say is my first point. I'll hand over to Priscilla so as to not keep going.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I feel like when we have a better understanding, especially in the programmatic side of what communications entails, it makes our translation, quote unquote, work easier, because at times it feels like translating like a very different vocabulary, but also very complex areas. At Whose Knowledge, we have programs that are acting on questions that are very diverse, and we are in service of and working with communities that are very different from each other. And sometimes it's hard to navigate the different terms that you have to be able to explain and to understand in order to do good communications. I also think that, and I've been reflecting on this for some time, like what are the key elements of these that make our jobs easier, but at times also more complex. And I think at Whose Knowledge, one thing that stood out to me when I joined and keeps coming back is how we understand that we're not necessarily just communicating what we do, but we are connecting with. And for me, that's a big shift in how we can integrate the two teams, but also the organization as a whole. If we are not just worried about putting our messages out there, but rather working together to connect with communities that are not separate from us also. So we come from these communities and we have relationships with these communities. We are in solidarity with them. How does that affect our relationships as communications teams, but also programs teams? And I think part of the things that we do at Whose Knowledge are influenced by that common understanding, how well connected we end up being as a small team as well. The lines are a bit blurred in that sense. But also I think that's a key point for us, shifting the communicating for somebody or communicating, putting your message out there and trying to push a little bit for let's connect with. And that's a very challenging position to be in, but I think at times it helps us navigate this separation of programmatic side versus or with the communications work.
Thank you so much, both. And I think we're really sort of moving in the direction where we should explore or try to look deeper at this relationship between programs and communications teams. And it's interesting also, you know, as someone who is still new and learning, you know, trade communications, to hear your perspectives. It's very reassuring to me that my hunger and thirst to sort of understand more about trade is actually leading me in the right direction so that I feel like I'm part of a bigger thing. Could you tell us, either of you, I mean, both of you definitely, we definitely want to hear from both of you. When you look at the relationship between the programs and the communications teams in your, you know, from your experience and also in your workplaces, how do you think they impact how the stories or how you tell the stories on behalf of the organization and what kind of stories you're also telling on behalf of your organization?
So what I think is, again, I'm going back to the grouse of communications being, seen as a service provider. But what usually happens is, you know, when proposals, I'm talking about a nonprofit scenario, when proposals are being written, you hastily bung together, as a way of accountability and showing the impact of the program, we'll do XYZ things, which would include a blog, which would include a podcast, which would include, there'd be 3 things that you just put into a proposal. And then usually the idea is that we'll see as things happen, we will see how to work with it. 2 years or 3 years pass, and then you'd have maybe even a new comms team for all you know. And then they're suddenly sitting with a new context, a new they hardly understand what's being said or why the project happened in the way it happened. And then suddenly you're told, you need to create a podcast because we are nearly at the fag end of the project. And you're like, but why have you decided to do a podcast? And that's when, but because we've already said that in the proposal and we've never changed it through the proposal. So to me, a scenario like that happens because, one, there's no institutional memory documentation ever. Even us as comms, we are guilty of never doing that. There's never, like a process mapper or why we are doing what we are doing kind of document. 2, on the other end, from the programs team as well, there's this feeling that, the siloed working thing of, we are the experts, we will tell you what the content is, and then you do your expertise of, making it look pretty. Now, the fact is that what is story to a practitioner might not be a story to the audience, even to a donor. So the donor's perspective, wearing the lens of a donor, is very different from wearing the lens of, being a practitioner. So if you're going for a conference of communicators, the way you talk would be very different from how you would talk to a donor. So this is what I usually try and tell, teams that I work with, that the communications team, or at least one representative of your comms team, should be there from the time that a proposal is put together. Because from the seed of the idea, that's when you know what's the possibility and what's the scope of developing it for different audiences. And if there are passionate storytellers within your program team, then, building that relationship is what it takes. Because what I've realized through each stage of my career is that it's the silos that are difficult to break. It's not the process, or it's not the stories that are difficult to crack. It's that silos and the set of that thinking that I'm the expert in this field, so I will do my piece and then I will hand it over to you. Instead of thinking of it as, a project that we can all do together, and, and all of us bring in our expertise in equal measure.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Dipti. Priscilla?
That resonates so powerfully with other experiences I've had, especially having that cycle of, okay, these experts, they think they put together their work and then they hand it over to you, and that separation is just, it makes our job so much harder to do. But one thing that I think is interesting for us in terms of ethos knowledge and like my most recent experiences and how we tell stories in comms is it makes a lot of difference to be not only looped in the sense of like put us in copy in the email, but also to be involved early on in the processes. And it makes all the difference. Usually we do that by having always somebody from the comms team holding or co-holding any part of the programmatic side of things. So if we have like an editathon, which is the type of event that we sometimes have at Who's Knowledge, there is somebody who is going to be at the meetings so that we are able to report back and have a sense of what's going on. Not only for the sake of visibility, but sometimes we have something to add to the conversation, even if we're not there like in the whole meeting. But also to build together the type of communications work that makes sense for each context. Not necessarily that's perfect, and we have a team with different expertises within the comms team, but having at least that connection helps us connect with the whole organization a little bit better. And to always have that dynamic of holding the process with somebody from the programmatic side is helpful. When I joined the organization, I remember I was doing the interviewing process, and our co-director, Adele Vrana, I remember she used an expression to describe like the importance of communications and how she wanted me to approach my role, as understanding the organization not as like there is programs and then there is communications, or there is what we do with sprinkles of communications on top, but rather as something that has communications at its core. And that for me was a really good starting point on how we work, but also how I and we as a comms team can push for things to get better. So we need to be looped in early on in the process. If you're writing a proposal, we can talk with somebody from the programmatic side to decide what are the options we have, what is the best way to communicate that. And also, we also have to consider we're dealing with the programmatic side, we're dealing with communications, but also our communities that are not necessarily there physically, but we have to take that to heart. And how do we make sure that we are we're acknowledging that, but also taking that to heart to what we do in designing communications, but also the programs we have. So I'll stop here because I'm talking too much at this point, but that's how I think it kind of impacts what we do and what we tell as stories.
Thank you so much, both. I feel like there's so much convergence in terms of what you're both saying. You know, Priscilla, you talking about sort of like the sprinkles of communications in the different departments, and Dipti, also you just mentioning breaking the silos. I think there's just like, I feel like things are coming together in terms of the ideas. And since we're talking about, you know, involving the comms team from the beginning, this collaboration, what are some of the most important aspects, you know, of this collaboration between programs and communications in your organization? And what are some of the things that remain a challenge? Priscilla, you'd started kind of going in this direction. So would you like to start?
Yeah, okay. I think that are a few elements. First, there's no like strict separation. And at times we have some room to say, I would really like to join that conversation, even if I'm not from the program side. And I've had moments when I was like, I'm really excited about this partnership. Can I join like the conversations early on? I want to suggest that we do something. So not having that strict separation makes things easier, because at the same time you can suggest and you can be involved, and there is an element of passion there. Like, we're not just passionate about communications. Like, sometimes you want to do an experiment with other parts of what the work of that organization is. So that's, for me, that's something good to have in mind. The other thing is that, and like my position here is like co-lead, and usually we do things that are like co-lead, co-manager. And we understand that that's a key component of how we do things. I'm not expected to have like all the expertise. And I think we, as a comms team, we have different backgrounds, and we come together to figure out how to do things in ways that are very different sometimes. I come from a more journalistic background, and there are people who come from activism, who have been more active in the tech sector. So that type of expertise comes in handy, because we're not expected to lead necessarily and to just know it all, or at least have just the clearest of senses of everything that is communications work, but also to work together. And that's a key process for me. And also, I think there's always room to learn stuff, because, and I could relate so much with what you were saying, Joan, about sometimes communicating about things that are so difficult for you to grasp at times when you're just a newbie. And joining Whose Knowledge, I had I didn't have a clear sense of the Wikiverse, like Wikipedia, Wikimedia, Wikidata, all these names, they were very foreign to me. And I think what made a difference was being able to ask the questions, but also to be like, can you give me like, I don't know, a piece of reading for me to get a better sense? Or can we do some like learning, some like knowledge sharing? That type of thing has been very helpful. So that's another part of what I think works for us. And not just communications and programmatic side working together, but within the communications team, we have a chance to learn more about things that we're not 100% sure about. We had a pretty recent one on alt text, how to do alt text writing for accessibility and approaching that in a way that would make sense for our communities. And that takes time. And we kind of try to push ourselves to find the time to do that, because it is difficult at times. Like, we assume that we're such great communicators, but there are certain parts of what we do that are more difficult. I tend to write super long alt text, and I have to learn to do that, and having the space to do it, but also people working with you to find a better way of doing stuff is also a key component. I'm trying to think of like other elements, but yeah, these are the things that kind of stand out to me.
Thanks, Priscilla. Thank you so much. Dipti?
building on what Priscilla was saying, because I don't want to repeat all the important things that she mentioned, I think the first questions that I usually ask is, who's the audience? Who are we communicating with and communicating to? That makes a lot of difference to how I would say something. Especially a lot of our external communications as a nonprofit is, geared towards donors, to be able to increase philanthropy coming into our regions. So the way I would communicate about, I work in the human rights and women's rights sector. So the way I would communicate to them would be vastly different from if I were to do something with grantees. So if there's a grantee convenings, I'm usually looking at creating different pieces of communications, one which only goes out to grantees, which because of issues of consent, confidentiality, and various other aspects. What I create for donors is usually something which catches the eye faster, because I always think of communications as what is your elevator pitch? How, and that's again a jargon, but how quickly can you say your message? So I start usually thinking of the message as something that can be understood in 30 seconds. Can I break it down into 3 key points? And then based on that is where, we start working on how it should come together. At UAV ANP, one of the advantages that I now have is I'm also the learning facilitator. And so I do have, kind of like a perfect perspective of what each program's working on, because one, there's a lot of effort that goes into talking with them, figuring out at what stage of a program they are. Are they conceptualizing? Do they need help with facilitation, et cetera, et cetera? So at all stages of the program, I'm aware of what's happening. And if I'm not aware, like Priscilla said, the questions help. And then when you're bringing it together, you already have ideas on what are the different pieces of the puzzle that can come together. For example, when you have a grantee report, how do you use a grantee report without compromising on their confidentiality? The way we found was to create a graphic narrative. So we created it like a comic, which isn't, I'm not talking about the humor part, but I'm talking about creating it as a graphic storytelling of, how having a grant from us supported this person. So I feel there are multiple ways in which, you can bring elements together. But ultimately what you really need as a comms team is to have a ringside view, so that you're viewing what's happening from the perspective of the audience that you need to communicate to. Because then we find it easy to find the words that will help sell the story, or, sell the situation, or sell is a bad word, but communicate the situation better to audiences that we need to talk to. See, I'm constantly autocorrecting myself. That's also a communication problem.
It's as Jennifer said, we're very guilty of that. And that's one of the things that we're trying to also just remind ourselves about in this space. Yeah. So Dippy, you are just exhibiting something that we all do. You're in good company. Yeah. I think at this point, we're going to open it up to questions, because we already have a question from Laura. And Laura, I really hope that you're here. But I'm going to, yes, awesome, Laura. Are you able to ask your question, or would you like me to do that?
Sure, I can. I am representing the weather where I live in my outfit. Yeah, I feel like an interloper. This is my first Healing Solidarity session, and I'm actually on a program team, but I came because I'm really interested in what you think about this. And the question is based on this document that I was just working on last night. So it's a real thing where, like, I was wondering, how do you work with program teams to improve the quality of their writing so that your first draft is a strong first draft? And it's like basic stuff like passive voice, which has a political thing of then you're obfuscating who's the actor, who is doing the strategic partnering or whatever. Or run-on sentences, which for me is important because I work in regions with a lot of English as a second language readers, and so long sentences is too hard, and jargon too. So I feel uncomfortable giving senior leadership feedback like that. So I was wondering like how we improve the quality of writing even at the senior levels of the organization.
I could maybe start with examples of what has actually transpired. Within our team, there was someone who was responsible for pushing the blogs out. And she had a tough time getting people to write first. If they write, it was, like you said, Laura, really difficult to work with. So the kind eye perspective, which was rarely practiced, because as communicators, we can also be super bitches and look down upon people who can't write. But the kind eye perspective to that would be, is English their first language? Can you ask for a concept to be written? So when we would give a blog, when the blog idea would be discussed, we'd say, can you write this like you would describe it to your grandmother? So that, you're really breaking it down. And can you try and say something in 700 words? So I've found that giving handrails to people from the very beginning kind of helps them, and also setting the process in place. So especially when you're communicating with senior leadership, if you were to tell them that you could send it in whatever form, if you're someone who likes to write expansively, and perhaps we could take, a whack at cleaning it up, or, making it into the way that blogs need to be written for it to be interesting to the audiences. So it's never about you wanting to do something, because as long as we take us out of the picture, I think it lands well, because everybody wants their writing to look really fabulous and get a lot of, views and clicks and whatnot. So if we're working on making the other person look fabulous, and I clearly think that this is the safe space to say that, if we're working towards that, I don't think that has a problem. At least that's how we tackled it. It was still difficult. Run-on sentences, very difficult. You just need to sit on it and, work at it yourself. But other bits, I feel there is hope.
Priscilla, would you like to have a go?
Yes, I mean, building on what was already said, I think it is a fabulous way of approaching that. And I love the use of fabulous here, let me just say that. And I think overall, it's important to, early on, even like in the onboarding process, when somebody joins the organization in other areas that are not comms, to have a sense of how we talk about things. And that's not necessarily, that's not part of comms exclusively, but do we say we? Who do we mean by we? Do we have like specific words that we use? And whose knowledge we usually say minoritized majority of the world instead of saying minorities, because we're not talking about like smaller numbers here. We're talking about the vast majority of the population. So learning that part, I think it is a crucial step for things to be done relatively well. Not only in the sense of, is the sentence long, but is it presenting the type of framings that we're trying to put out there? And that's a key part of communications for me, at least. Sometimes I think coming from a journalistic background, sometimes I felt like some editors wouldn't try to make my text better. They would try to make it more like what they write, like their style. And I try to do that as a comms person, because people can have very different ways of presenting information, and that's their style of writing. We want to make it clear. We want to make sure that there is no the noise won't get in the way, in the sense of people are not understanding that. But at the same time, to what extent can I just trim it down, like really edit it, like to the level that I would be happy with that? How can I balance the fact that people write differently? So that's another thing to consider. And I think also that's something that I heard from an editor. Nothing good is ever written, but rewritten, in the sense that, and that's a good part of what I've learned at Whose Knowledge, like to write collectively, not only like doing work sprints sometimes, because there are things that are super dense and super difficult to grasp. And sometimes we have to come together to write. If I find it super easy to write this paragraph and this other person is killing it in the other paragraph, why not combine the two in a work sprint, but also to work asynchronously? So you drafted, I would do the like second pass. And usually whatever we put out there in the world has at least, I would say like 3 or 4 versions, because we do it like the programmatic side of Whose Knowledge does it. And then the co-directors have a look at it. And we have all these layers of a labor of love, but also it takes a lot of time. And incorporating that as part of processes is a challenge, but I think it is worth doing, because blog posts take time, reports take a lot of time. And we want to be mindful of these cycles of editing that will make the final project better. But that's also a learning opportunity as well. I do think that after a few times doing that, people get better at grasping how to write for this particular audience, or for saying, oh, actually, we are not using that adjective anymore. Can we use another word here? So then the programmatic side will actually suggest things for you that is like there in the cons. So that's also like understanding these processes as learning opportunities that also take time. That's one thing that I would bring to the conversation as well.
And Laura, some other folks have added some thoughts for you in the chat. It can be helpful to frame this kind of encouragement as an accessibility issue. So helping them to think through that this is who we're writing for, the audience, right? And then Katan has agreed. I just finalized some blog guidelines for the org's practitioners, as well as the local partners we work with similar tips. Yeah, the tips are great. We can't avoid the feedback and the managing up. It's part of the thing, unfortunately, particularly for organizations that are more oriented towards delivering technical assistance, like that's a centering, there is a self-centering in some of the larger institutions in how they think of themselves in the equation of change. So that's what we're talking about in terms of narrative change too. It's not just about the passive voice, it's the who's thinking they're the center of the thing, right? And so these are challenging things to address, but language is also this wonderful, strange way to do that at times too. It's an entry point. So thank you, guests. There's a couple more. Larissa, do you want to share, or would you like us to share?
Hi everyone. I can share. Hi Priscilla, especially I'm also Brazilian. I love to say at the beginning about the shifting communication from putting the message out there to being part of the same system as the communities that we speak about. And I was wondering, I was thinking that this doesn't concern only how communications see itself or how we position ourselves at ComStream, but also how does the whole organization hold space for us to feel and operate that way, like feeling a part of the system. So I was curious to hear some tips or some experiences about how have you been putting this into practice, and what are, or at least what is the biggest challenge you see in that? Thanks.
Can I respond to that, or do you want to get more questions from the chat?
Oh, please go ahead.
Ed.
That's such a challenge, first of all, and hi from a fellow Brazilian. Super excited to have somebody from my country here. And I jot down a few things so I don't forget, because it's super challenging. And not only in the sense of let's make people aware of how we want to do things and connect with, but also sometimes we as communications professionals, we carry some like background that makes us communicate in one way or the other. Coming from a journalistic background, sometimes I'm super like, I want things to be quick and like, let's put the message out there. And in that sense, I think having co-leads helps, because sometimes there is a need to slow down and somebody has to be the person to tell you that. So that's one thing. There is a level of accountability that comes with having teams that are very diverse in background and that have a sense of we can rethink how we do comms. And we've been grappling with the question of radical communications and what that means for us as Whose Knowledge, and that's an ongoing conversation. That involves a lot of accountability, and that involves, okay, you're going too fast, or can we slow it down for the sake of what we call spaciousness, not only in the sense of let's post less, but let's do the job in a way that is healthy and that realizes that what we do as like work, like paid work, is not our entire lives. So we have a limited amount of hours. So that level of accountability is a key component, and how we see work and having that common understanding, I think it's helpful for us at Whose Knowledge. And that's something that it's a learning process for me, but also having the room to learn these new ways of doing comms is an interesting thing for me. As more practical things that we do for doing connect with rather than just communicate to or with. First, who are the people we're inviting to do not only the comm side or the programmatic side? In some of the things that we do, we like to bring what we call unusual allies. And do we bring people from the tech side with people who are librarians, with people who are like community leaders, indigenous leaders in different regions? How do we make sure that we're bringing these unusual allies? And I think it pushes the type of people we're inviting to the conversation. And usually what comes out of it makes communications different. Sometimes there is a new way of framing things that comes out of these discussions. Sometimes because there is such a diverse group of people, things get explained in a way that is so much easier. We had a convening that was focused on decolonizing structure data, which is a very dry subject if you think about it at times. It's like a core component of how the internet works. And I was super like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to translate that sometime in the future. And the fact that it was such a diverse group of people from different professional backgrounds made it easier because the definitions were there. I was able to fully understand it. And I think that's a core component of how we do comms. That level of plurality, not just diversity, is a key component. The folks that you invite to these events, do you invite them to write stuff? And do you make them like comfortable enough to share their thoughts in their language? Also, I think we're speaking here in English. That's my first language. Probably it's not yours either, Larissa. And it's super hard. So do you create the space for them to express themselves and to bring the reflections in a way that is meaningful to them, that understands where they're coming from? So creating that space is also important. And there's a lot of translation work, like literal translation, that goes into communications work. And that's something to bear in mind as well. And also amplifying their work. I think in interactions with the programmatic side of things, I often ask like, okay, but what do you want us to bring to our channels? Like, how can we best support you? And the answer can be very different. We deal with communities that have very different needs, and understanding that it's not like a monolithic type of thing. Just because you're dealing with, there is one program that we have that brings together Indigenous women from different communities. They have very different needs, and having that at the core of how you do things is a good starting point. So asking, how do we amplify what you're doing, the messages you want to put out there, and how do we combine that with with how we think of the organization we're at? Some of the people in this program, they were running for office here in Brazil. So how do we amplify their message? In what context? How do we navigate that? The specificities of the communities they come from. I'll shut up now, but it's a very long conversation, ladies, and we can connect later as well.
Wonderful. Jennifer?
Yeah, and we have one more question from Alessandra that I really want to get to. We have 5 minutes left. This often happens to us in this gathering. There's so much good energy in only 1 hour. So more than likely we'll go over the hour. So this is your moment to peel off if you need to peel off. But if you want to stay an extra 10 minutes, we're also really excited to do that. So we'll just have a pause for anyone who needs to go. We will mention that the next meeting is December 14th. It's always the second Wednesday of every month. We're going to have a year-end reflection and some prompt questions, and just have a little celebration and a breather. If you're surviving fundraising season, you're going to need a breather. And you're welcome to that. And just to let you know, there's all kinds of events happening in the collective, and you're always welcome to check that out and join. We're particularly always inviting people into the spaces for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, particularly healing sessions. And welcome. We're so glad you're here and that you joined us today. And now we'll hand over for Alessandra's question. Alessandra, do you want to share it?
Sure. Oh my gosh, I love how you're saying my name. I think that sounds so beautiful. But I'm from Chicago, so I'm saying Alexandra. It's not as nice. So I just had a quick question. I mean, it's not a quick question. We could probably talk about it for like 10 years. But basically, my organization is growing a lot. And I think that there might be like a really key opportunity here to shift some of the norms and like the organizational culture from Dipti, what you said at the beginning about like in service to like as a service provider. And I have an agency background. So Priscilla, I really resonated, like my background informs how I think about my work, right? And a lot of times I think of my colleagues as my client. And that's not serving the organization, nor is that doing the due diligence for like the very real work that is like comms and not just like helping people like helping my team with the deliverables that are in the grants is like for the health of our organization. And I've made some inroads there. But as we're growing in ambition and new team members, I feel like there might be an opportunity to shift some of that thinking, but I don't even know where to get started. So for some of y'all who are in a better place now, or like in the process, it would be really excellent to hear, like, how are you able to get leadership and your colleagues buy-in to really appreciate that comms is more than just putting stuff on Twitter, or because we're a lot of us tend to be pretty tech savvy, like helping fix IT issues or website management. Thank you so much.
This clearly seems to be something that all of us have in common. Like it's a shared trauma that we are healing here. But that said, I'd love to put on my learning hat here, because this is actually something that we ran as 2018 is when Urgent Action Fund was set up. And I've been with them since 2019, January. And we actually ran this like an experiment. How do we build that culture where we are talking more, where we are communicating more? You know, things don't come from our blind side. And then, because that's when stress builds up. That's when, you have these conversations which are not productive, where, like what I was saying, you come in, if comms comes in at the fag end of a process, then you're just doing a patch-up job. You're not really doing service. I mean, you're doing disservice to a beautiful project, and, not really focusing on the outcomes, but just looking at what can be put out in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of heartache, if I may put it that way. But what we realized is, if you're intentional about building a culture of sharing and, building spaces where this can happen, what first gets transformed is your relationship. So you stop thinking of the us versus them dichotomy, like the programs team versus the comms team versus the IT team. Suddenly you start seeing new collaborations forming. And it could be as simple as because of, your human friendships or relationships. I mean, if you're working in the same office, the cafeteria conversation or the cooler conversation is easier. I have a remote working profile. So you have to be very intentional about catching up. You have to be very intentional about talking about things. What are the challenges? And sometimes you have to go out of your way. It might not be part of your job description. But building that team culture is what has helped us, to get those impromptu sharings where someone's working on creating a concept note. You're being spoken to kind of figure out, does this resonate? Is this making sense? So, you then become that curious voice asking, who's the audience? What are you doing this for? What are the kind of, short, long, medium term conversations that you're going to have? So my suggestion to you would be, go about it intentionally. Set yourself small goals on how you will, one, create spaces for these conversations, and two, about how do you sustain these conversations, because doing them once or twice won't help. But if you do it over a year, you can already see the ease with which people start sharing. That's, that I think would be a start.
Thanks. Yeah, so insightful. And I thank you both, Priscilla and Deepthi, for the very practical wisdom that you all share. Like, this is our zone as communicators. We're often shape-shifting between different spaces and audiences. And this narrative change business is so it's just so much bigger than the words we choose, right? But it is the accumulation of words that eventually creates the change. So we are holding a lot, and I think what you're talking about, Alexandra, is also just how do we start to make everyone think about narrative change, not just us? And then that is about organizational shifts sometimes fundamentally. But how do we ensure that they also see comms as part of organizational strategy? That's what we're actually advocating for, that comms becomes part of how we achieve our mission and vision and values. And I've seen, there's actually a recording in the collective where Natalie Lairdy at IIED in the UK used analysis of their blogs and their reports through an equity lens, and got all of that equity stuff churned up in a really powerful and practical way. So comms is an entry point for all kinds of conversations. And unfortunately, I also want to say in a practical way, we're under-resourced and overworked. Our teams are under-resourced and overworked. So we have to also get realistic for ourselves. And we have to say no. We don't need to blast out content every single day in the cacophony that is the World Wide Web. Like, this is the time for us to be super strategic for ourselves and for our colleagues. So thank you both, Priscilla and Deepthi, for bringing that forward today, and for this amazing conversation. Thank you, Joanne, for bringing these two wonderful humans to the table. We hope you can enjoy these conversations every month, and you're always very, very welcome. Anything else
Thank
to
you
add?
so much.
Yeah.
And I just want to say thank you so much, Priscilla and Dipti. From the moment I reached out to both of you, you were just so wonderful. Like, you were responsive, you were ready, and you just brought that energy here, like so much sunshine and joy. Thank you so much for just sharing, without holding back. And I'm just so glad that we're connected. And I hope that, this is not the first or the last time that you'll be here, but you're going to be coming back. We'd love to have you again. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Take good care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Do you want to press stop, Joanne?